You're listening to Beyond the Sermon, the podcast of First Methodist Church in Collingswood, New Jersey. Our goal is not only to share our sermons, but to go beyond the sermon in conversation about what we're learning and what God is doing in our lives and in our community. This sermon comes from our 2022 sermon series, Digital Babylon, Developing Resilient Faith in Exile. You can find more information about our church at fumccollingswood.org. Thanks for listening.
Well, this morning we are continuing our series, Digital Babylon, Developing Resilient Faith in Exile. Last week we kicked off this series looking at what it means to live in exile here in Digital Babylon. And if you missed last week's introductory sermon, it's available on our website, fumccollingswood.org. It's on our YouTube channel. It's even on our podcast feed. And Jeremy and I had a conversation about it this week that posted on Wednesday. So you can check those out as well if you missed last week. But the rest of this series, we're going to be fleshing out how do we become resilient disciples. Disciples who live faithfully in the face of cultural coercion and who live vibrant lives in the Spirit. We're going to do that by looking at 5 marks of resilient disciples that came out of Barna's research and how those 5 marks answer 5 questions that all of us ask at some point or another, and 5 questions that we must find answers to if we're going to follow Jesus well. In our culture, in our context. And so today, I want to jump right into that scripture reading that Jeremy just read for us. I'm sure for many of you, David and Goliath is a story that's familiar. Even if you didn't grow up in Sunday school, you've probably been familiar with at least the basic gist of the story. We're not quite there yet, Max. But the young underdog, right? The little shepherd boy armed only with a sling and a stone, sent out to face impossible odds. The shepherd boy versus the giant warrior. And David walks right out onto the battlefield, full of confidence that God always wins his battles and that God was going to win this battle too. But have you ever wondered, have you ever asked the question, how did David get to that point in his life? How did a shepherd boy, the youngest son in a line of 8 boys, I mean, that's even more than I have, right? The youngest son in the line of 8 boys, a boy from a small, insignificant village. How did he develop such a strong faith that God could not only defeat his enemies, but that he would? Where does that kind of resilience come from? And what can we learn from this story that can help us as we seek to become resilient disciples? I think to answer that question well, we've got to go back a bit earlier in the story. You see, you don't just wake up one day with that kind of resilience. You don't just wake up one day with that kind of faith. It's something that's developed over time and often out of sight. So in chapter 16 of 1 Samuel, God had sent the prophet Samuel to Bethlehem. Still not there yet, Max. Chapter 16, God sent Samuel to Bethlehem to anoint the new king of Israel. God sent Samuel to the home of Jesse to anoint one of Jesse's sons. He was going to be the next king of Israel. And so they come before Samuel one by one, all the sons who are in the home. But God says, these aren't the one. None of these guys are the one. And so Samuel asks, well, are there any more sons? And Jesse's like, oh yeah, there's one more. And I get that, when there's all that kind of perpetual action going on in your house with a bunch of boys running around, you don't always know where all of they are or if they've all been fed at the right times. It's a little crazy sometimes. But Jesse says, there's one more. There's one son, he's out in the field. He's keeping watch over the sheep. So Samuel says, bring him. I want to see him. So they send for the boy And David comes before Samuel, and God says, this is the one. This is the one that you're going to anoint to be the next king of Israel. So then in chapter 17, the story continues. But the story starts long before we get to verse 40, where Jeremy started reading this morning. The story begins with the Philistines and the Israelites set up for battle. All right? You've got Israelites on this side, you've got the Philistines on that side, standing across, staring at each other, wondering who's going to make the first move. Now, in those days, before the main battle was fought and everyone came out and fought in the valley, each side would send forth their champion, their biggest warrior, their strongest, most skilled fighter, the one who intimidates all the other people. And the winner of that fight between those two individuals was seen as like a sign, an omen of who was going to win the big battle. And so the Philistines send out their champion, Goliath. And that we've become so familiar with that name, Goliath, that we even added on to, it's the name of a tank or a missile or something, big scary things that are supposed to strike fear into people's hearts. And so they send out their champion. And Goliath comes out day after day, taunting the army of Israel. And he does that for every morning, for every evening, for 40 days he does it. Coming out, waiting for someone to step up. And no one in the army of Israel will rise up to the challenge. No one will take a step and say, I'll go fight Goliath. Not even King Saul, who when he was anointed, we're told he stood head and shoulders above all of his fellow Israelites. And he won't go face Goliath. So eventually, 40 days of this, and Jesse's home saying, wonder how my boys are doing out there on the battlefield. And so he sends David with a care package, some food to take to his brothers, encourage them, but also to get the news of what's going on there at the battle, to bring back a report of how those boys are doing for their dad. And when David gets there, he hears Goliath's challenge. He hears the taunting, the way he's defying the God of Israel. And David cannot believe that no one will step up to face this ungodly Philistine. So he volunteers. He says, I'll go do it. All right, and you can just imagine, spunky little kid. No fear of anything. So he gets brought before Saul and declares that he will go and fight that giant. I almost imagine Saul just kind of standing there laughing. David, pat, 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 right on the head, You can't go fight this Philistine. You're only a boy, and he is a trained warrior. You can't do it. You don't stand a chance. But I want you to listen to David's response from 1 Samuel chapter 17, beginning in verse 34. But David said to Saul, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. And when a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it. I struck it and rescued the sheep from its mouth. And when it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant. I've killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be just like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the bear will rescue me from the hand of the Philistine. So Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. You see, David understood that God wasn't just going to send him into the battle, but God was going to go with him into the battle because David had already seen God do it in the past. He'd done it for him before with the lion and the bears. Now, listen, I've seen a lion before. I'm sure you've seen one at a zoo or something. That's not something you want to mess with. I've seen a bear. I'm not really looking to go wrestle and, to be close enough to strike it and kill it like that. That doesn't sound like a good day to me, right? But David's done it. He's seen it at work. He's seen God at work. And all the time that David had spent in the field watching over the sheep, which remember was exactly where he was when Samuel called for him to anoint him as the king, all that time, David was developing a relationship of intimacy with God. He experienced God in an intimate way. He wasn't just a God out there. He wasn't just a God who was worshiped in the tabernacle. David knew God. And that's how over days and weeks and months, he got to know God in such an intimate way that he could write things like, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." We've talked about that a couple times over the last few months, that psalm, but all the other psalms that show this deep intimacy that David had with God. That's how he became what God called a man after my own heart. The time that David spent hidden away in obscurity led to his development of an intimate relationship with God. The story in 1 Samuel 17 goes on to say that before David sent out Goliath, Saul dressed David up in his own personal armor. You have this picture in your mind? Little boy, big king, armor. Just imagine little kids playing dress up, putting on the firefighters' equipment or something when you go visit the fire station. It's ridiculous. It's adorable, but it's ridiculous, right? There's no way they could actually do anything wearing that kind of equipment. And David realizes, I can't go fight like this. David couldn't wear Saul's armor because he wasn't used to it. He wasn't fit for it, and it wasn't fit for him. I'd imagine, like I said, that it was a little big on him. David couldn't wear Saul's armor because David wasn't Saul. And he couldn't pretend to be Saul. See, David knew who God was, but he also knew who he was. There's some other stuff going on here with the anointing and the kingship and other stuff. We're not going to get into all that. But David understood he could never step into Saul's place. So he took off Saul's armor. He wasn't going to pretend to be someone he wasn't. And he went into the battle with his staff in one hand and his sling in the other. You heard the rest when Jeremy read it for us earlier. David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. And this has everything, friends, to do with our living life in exile in digital Babylon. If we are going to develop followers of Jesus who remain resiliently faithful in the face of cultural coercion and who live vibrant lives in the Spirit, we must develop an identity-shaping intimacy with Jesus. Among those young adults who grew up in the church, and remember, this isn't just for the young people, this is for all of us. You can go back and watch last week's sermon if you didn't quite catch that or you needed the refresher. But among those young adults who grew up in the church, remember we had 4 different categories. 100% of nomads, who were those who kind of drift out of church. 100% of churchgoers who attend church maybe once a month or not in a while and hold more onto the values of the world. And 100% of resilient disciples, those who attend church at least once a month, remain faithful to biblical values. 100% of those three groups self-identify with the Christian faith, right? If they didn't, they would have been put into the category of prodigal that we talked about, those who chose to leave the church. But 100% of nomads, churchgoers, and resilient disciples identify with the Christian faith. However, only 58% of nomads and 81% of churchgoers actually identify as a Christian. So say we're part of the Christian faith, but to say they're actually a Christian, the number starts to drop off. If pushed further, just half of churchgoers would say that their relationship with Jesus impacts the way they live their everyday life. Less than half of churchgoers believe their Christian faith impacts how they live from Monday through Saturday. That number drops to a quarter for the nomads. The numbers are similar if you ask them what to respond to following Jesus shapes my whole life. Now, I don't want you to get caught up in all those percentages. The exact numbers aren't what's important. What's important to me is the reality that the young adults who are being raised in our churches don't think following Jesus should change the way we live our lives. I mentioned earlier that people are asking 5 major questions in our lives. Some of those questions are things like, am I loved? Right? We've all asked that question at some point. How do I live my life? Can I make a difference in the world? Another giant question in our lives is, who am I? Who am I? And in digital Babylon, there are any number of voices trying to answer that question for us. For David, the world said, you're just a shepherd boy. You're the runt of the family. You're just a kid. Those are the voices that David heard. But the voices of digital Babylon tell us that we need to find our own, not just our own identity, but our own brand. You see, we live in a world of social media influencers and personal brands, and more than a quarter of teenagers right now believe that they're probably going to be famous before they turn 25. Right? This culture tells us that we can and should define our own identity. We just need to find it inside ourselves, determine what is true for us and our desires, and pursue that. We must define who we are for ourselves. Sadly, in much of the modern church, I think we've co-opted into this way of thinking. And rather than offering people a relationship with Jesus, a person that you can know and interact with and understand, we've offered them something more like brand Jesus. We offer affiliation with Jesus on the same level as any other affiliation, like the Rotary Club or being an Eagles fan, rather than a life-altering mission that requires something of us. So we'll open the Bible and we'll read a verse and we'll say, well, what does this verse mean to me? Forget the fact that the church has been interpreting it for 2,000 years. What's it mean to me? And we'll determine what it means for my reality. And Jesus becomes just one more badge we wear as part of our identity, rather than the reality that defines our identity. And so if we're going to become resilient disciples and develop resilient disciples who remain faithful in exile, we must develop an intimate relationship with Jesus and draw our identity from him. So I want to take a few minutes and look at 5 insights, like those 5 stones that David picked up from the stream and took into battle with him. 5 insights about how we can experience Jesus in a way that will help us remember who we are and stay faithful to our true home, even in exile. Ready? 5 things. Number 1, We've got to experience Jesus together. We'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about the practice of meaningful relationships. But those who become resilient disciples tend to be loved into their experience of Jesus. There are people in their lives who have invested in them and whose love becomes a relational pathway for them to get to know Jesus. People along the way whose impact shows them the way to Jesus. As David Kinnaman and Mark Matlock put it in the book Faith for Exiles, when older adults, I'm not pointing any fingers at anybody in the room, but when older adults model deep ways of following Jesus, young people notice. When older adults model deep ways of following Jesus, young people notice. This is why our faith must be personal, but it cannot be private. We've got to live our lives in such a way that those coming along behind us want to join us on the path and know our experience of Jesus. This is more than just passing on head knowledge about Jesus. It's more than just another Bible study on the cultural background of this certain situation that was going on in the gospel. It's more than just head knowledge. Young people need to see a compelling vision in our lives of what it looks like to have an intimate relationship with Jesus and a vital dependence on his Spirit. We've got to experience Jesus together. Number 2, we've got to make Christ the true north by which we navigate our lives. We've got to move away from offering Jesus as a brand and offer Jesus himself. We don't want to create a falsely Christian context that is really just Jesus-y labels slapped onto a Babylon worldview, right? That may mean we need to redesign some of the ways we do some of our ministry, some of our life together around the kind of whole life transformation required to make resilient disciples. A couple things we should think about as a church. Are the small groups and Bible studies that we do, are they shaped around seeking transformation together in our lives? Does our Sunday morning worship structure facilitate the transformation of lives and hearts? If not, are we willing to let Jesus change the way that we are the church together? We also need to be willing to speak against the ways that the culture of Babylon tries to make its way into the church. This means we must be willing to speak about things that are counter to the culture around us, right? Articulating God's vision for humanity and the world, even when it's unpopular. Babylon says, if it feels good, do it. But God says, this is the way. Walk in it. It's not about living my truth or you do you. It's about God's design and desire for us. It's about orienting ourselves to Jesus and allowing his transforming grace to work in our lives, even at the very deepest levels of who we are. So we've got to experience Jesus together. We've got to make Jesus the true north of our lives and in our church. And then number 3, for those of you taking notes at home, we've got to fearlessly ask the big questions of life, right? If we're going to anchor our search for identity in something deeper and truer than the constantly changing message of the culture around us, then we've got to make space where people feel that they have permission to ask and wrestle with the big questions of life. Part of developing resilient disciples is teaching them how to wrestle with those questions, right? We've got to be willing to ask those questions, wrestle with those questions, and not just shut them down. We've got to teach resilient disciples how to let God's word speak to those questions. Because what you believe matters, but so does why you believe it. It's one thing to say, I believe X because my second grade Sunday school teacher told me it was true. It's another thing to do the hard work of wrestling and reading and studying and discussing and asking those further along the journey for their experience and their wisdom and their understanding. If we're going to develop an intimacy with Jesus, it's going to mean offering more than just Sunday school answers and wrestling through those tough questions together. Number 4, we've got to get close and stay close to Jesus. If we're going to develop an intimacy with Jesus that shapes our identity, we've got to get close and stay close to Jesus. 2 areas from the Barna research show key priorities for resilient disciples are 1, experiencing God's presence in worship, and 2, a desire to grow in faith. Almost 9 out of 10 resilient disciples surveyed said that reading the Bible makes them feel closer to God. More than 8 out of 10 says that Jesus speaks to them. That number drops below 45% for churchgoers in both cases. Imagine the hours that David spent practicing with his sling, right? Before he could take out a lion or a bear or a giant. Now, somewhere along the way, my father-in-law, who never had any little boys, decided it was a good idea to make a slingshot for each of our boys when they turned 6. Great idea, right? Great idea. Right up until one of the boys leans out the window, shoots a rock, and shatters the glass top table on the back patio. I can't describe the devastation. It was awful. But to use a slingshot, to use a sling, you've got to practice, right? Or you're going to hit the table. You're going to break a window. You're going to hit a car. Like, you get it. But we need to spend that same kind of time building of spiritual practices into our lives, practicing them over days and weeks and months and years. And there's an intimacy in the connection that resilient disciples experience with Jesus. And that intimacy leads to a strong sense of identity in who God is and who we are. Finally, number 5. We've got to go to church. We've got to go to church. But we can't just expect church going alone to create intimacy with Jesus. I've said it before, I'll say it again, I'll say it probably till I die. Participating in worship is necessary, but it's not sufficient. It's not enough on its own. I think sometimes we mistake the starting point for the destination. And it's good to get people to make a commitment to come to church. But at the same time, is spending 1 hour a week with someone going to make that a life-defining relationship? Back when I was dating Meg, could I have expected our relationship to move toward a life-defining commitment if I only spent an hour a week with her? Could I have expected our relationship to grow after we made that kind of life-defining commitment to one another if I continued to spend only 1 hour a week with her? I can guarantee you, and those of you who have been in a relationship before can attest to it, that's not the case. Right? It takes daily investment in a relationship for it to grow beyond just familiarity and into the kind of life-giving, life-defining realm of intimacy. It's true with a spouse. It's true with Jesus. David found an intimate relationship with God in the midst of countless hours of practicing faithfulness hidden from the eyes of the world, as God shaped his character and formed his identity. And David was able to step onto the battlefield to face Goliath because he knew that God was with him, and he knew who God told him he was. We need to learn that same kind of intimacy with God. to learn to hear from God, to listen to him, to know his voice, to speak with him. Again, in the words of Kinnaman and Matlock, more than just believing the right things or feeling warm fuzzies about Jesus, being Christian is more than being on Team Jesus. It means we find the very essence of ourselves at his feet. If we are going to develop followers of Jesus who are resiliently faithful in the face of cultural coercion and who live vibrant lives in the Spirit, we are going to need to develop an intimacy with Jesus that touches every area of our lives, every corner of our heart, every hour of our day. Jesus needs to become not just a piece of our identity, but the unifying factor, the defining principle, and the source of who we are becoming. This is what it means to develop an identity-shaping